My name is Carol, and I am 68 years old. For 8 grueling years, my life became Tommy. My grandson, with his special needs and beautiful, innocent spirit, was my entire world. I poured every ounce of my retirement savings, my carefully planned golden years, my very being into his round-the-clock care, sacrificing my own future without a moment's hesitation, because I believed my selfless love was creating an unbreakable bond between us. From sunrise to sunset, I was his advocate, his protector, his constant companion through therapy sessions, medical appointments, and the countless small victories that made every sacrifice worthwhile. A minor surgery left me temporarily vulnerable, and Mark, my son, promised with tears in his eyes to care for Tommy during my brief recovery. Instead, just weeks later, a cold, legalistic letter arrived like a dagger through my healing heart. It accused me of systematic neglect, claiming my advanced age made me fundamentally unfit to care for a special needs child, stating that Tommy was gone, placed in a distant specialized facility for his own protection. My heart, already raw from the forced separation during my recovery, was utterly annihilated by this betrayal from my own flesh and blood. Yet as a retired school principal who had spent 40 years documenting student progress and family dynamics, I kept meticulous records of everything: daily care logs, detailed therapy reports, hundreds of photos and videos showing Tommy thriving under my devoted care. Dr. Evelyn Reed, his main therapist, knew the truth of my dedication and Tommy's remarkable progress. They would not erase my love or diminish Tommy's worth with their cruel lies. I would fight this monstrous deception with every breath in my body, for my reputation, for my sanity, and most importantly, for my beloved grandson who needed me now more than ever. Then, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my surgery, when I was finally strong enough to start planning Tommy's return to our daily routine. My hands shook as I read the formal letterhead from a law firm I had never heard of, the cold clinical language cutting through my heart like shards of glass. Due to concerns regarding the quality of care and your advancing age, Tommy has been placed in a specialized residential facility better equipped to meet his complex needs. The letter stated with brutal efficiency. This decision has been made in Tommy's best interests, and any attempt to interfere with this placement will be met with appropriate legal action. The words blurred together as shock and disbelief overwhelmed my ability to process what was happening. I immediately called Mark's number, my fingers fumbling with the phone as panic set in, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, leaving increasingly desperate messages that were never returned. "Mark, honey, please call me back," I pleaded into the phone, my voice breaking with confusion and growing fear. "There's been some terrible mistake with this letter about Tommy. We need to clear this up right away. Tommy needs to come home where he belongs." Every email I sent bounced back as undeliverable, as if Mark and Brenda had systematically erased themselves from my life with the same cold efficiency they had apparently used to remove Tommy from his home. The horrifying void of silence left me floating in a nightmare where my entire world had simply vanished without explanation or opportunity for appeal. The greed that drove Mark and Brenda's actions wasn't the simple desire for money, though that was certainly part of their calculation. Their greed was far more insidious and cruel, a profound selfishness that valued their own comfort and convenience over the well-being of a vulnerable child and the devastation of a loving grandmother. The letter they sent made their priorities crystal clear with phrases like fresh start and freedom from overwhelming responsibilities. We have decided to pursue new opportunities that require complete flexibility. One particularly chilling sentence read, "Tommy's needs have created limitations that are no longer sustainable for our family planning and career advancement." They were speaking about my grandson, my precious Tommy, as if he were a burden to be discarded rather than a child to be cherished and protected. The casual cruelty of reducing 8 years of loving care to overwhelming responsibilities revealed the shallow, self-centered nature of people I had somehow failed to recognize, despite knowing them for decades. In my desperation and maternal love, I clung to the hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, perhaps orchestrated by Brenda's influence over my son during a moment of weakness. I forced myself to remember Mark as the little boy who had once brought me dandelions and proudly showed me his school projects, searching desperately for any trace of the compassion he had shown as a child. Maybe the stress of caring for Tommy while I was in the hospital was too much. I told myself, pacing through the house that suddenly felt empty and lifeless without Tommy's presence. Maybe Brenda convinced him this was temporary, just until I fully recovered. Mark wouldn't really abandon his own son like this. But even as I tried to rationalize their actions, a growing dread settled in my stomach as days passed without any response to my increasingly frantic attempts to contact them. The silence was more terrifying than any angry confrontation would have been, suggesting a level of premeditation and finality that I wasn't prepared to accept. The public humiliation began with Brenda's final voicemail left on my phone, like a poisonous parting gift designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Her voice was cold and triumphant, carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been planning this moment for years. "Carol," she said with false sweetness that made my skin crawl, "I know this is hard for you to accept, but Tommy was just too much for you, wasn't he? You can finally admit it now. You were overwhelmed making mistakes, and he wasn't getting the specialized care he really needs. Now he'll finally get proper treatment from qualified professionals instead of an amateur who let emotions cloud her judgment. And honestly, Mark and I can finally have our lives back." The cruelty in her tone was breathtaking, turning 8 years of selfless devotion into evidence of inadequacy and presenting Tommy's removal as a mercy for all involved. But Brenda wasn't content with private cruelty. She wanted public validation for their actions. Shirley, my cousin who had always resented my close relationship with Tommy, became Brenda's enthusiastic ally in spreading malicious rumors throughout our small community. Within days of Tommy's disappearance, whispered conversations followed me wherever I went. Carol was always so overwhelmed with that poor child. Shirley told anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with false concern. I heard she wasn't really keeping up with his medications properly. Sometimes I'd visit, and the house was just chaos. It's probably for the best, really, for the child's sake. Tommy needs professional care, not just grandmotherly love. The rumors spread like wildfire through our church, our neighborhood, and the community centers where I had once been respected as a retired educator and devoted grandmother. People who had praised my dedication to Tommy for years suddenly looked at me with pity and judgment, whispering behind my back about my supposed incompetence and the tragedy of an elderly woman who had bitten off more than she could chew. The professional humiliation was equally devastating. Tommy's therapists and care coordinators, all of whom had worked closely with me and knew the quality of care I provided, began calling with carefully worded questions about my coping mechanisms and support systems, clearly having been fed a completely different version of events by Mark and Brenda. Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Matthews Tommy's pediatrician, said during one particularly painful call, I've been contacted about Tommy's case records being transferred to his new facility. I have to say I'm surprised by some of the concerns that have been raised about his home care situation. Perhaps we should have been providing more support and monitoring. The suggestion that I had somehow hidden my inadequacies from medical professionals who had worked with Tommy for years was insulting and terrifying. If Mark and Brenda could convince trained professionals that I was an incompetent caregiver, what chance did I have of ever seeing Tommy again or clearing my reputation in the community? The isolation became complete as former friends began avoiding me, either because they believed the rumors or because they simply didn't want to be associated with the controversy surrounding Tommy's removal. Invitations to social events stopped coming. Phone calls became less frequent, and I found myself increasingly alone with nothing but my memories and a growing determination to prove that everything Mark and Brenda had said about me was a lie. The combination of devastation, betrayal, and public humiliation was overwhelming. But underneath the pain, something harder and more dangerous was beginning to emerge. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about Mark and Brenda wanting freedom from responsibility. It was about the systematic destruction of my relationship with Tommy and my reputation as a caring, competent grandmother. They had declared war on me, and they were about to discover that underestimating a retired school principal who had spent 40 years fighting for children's welfare was a serious mistake. The first crack in Mark and Brenda's carefully constructed narrative came when I attempted to contact the specialized facility they had mentioned in their legal letter. After days of calling residential care centers within a reasonable distance from my home, I was forced to expand my search to neighboring states, driven by an increasingly desperate need to know where my grandson was being held. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson," the 10th or 15th administrator told me, her voice carrying the professional sympathy of someone who dealt with family crises regularly. "But we have no record of a child named Tommy being admitted to our facility. Are you certain you have the correct information?" The same response came from every facility I contacted, each conversation adding another layer of dread to my growing understanding of what had really happened. Mark and Brenda hadn't placed Tommy in a specialized care facility. They had simply made him disappear from my life with the same calculated efficiency they had used to cut off all communication with me. When I tried to reach them through their previous address, I discovered they had moved without leaving any forwarding information, even with the postal service. Their phone numbers had been disconnected, their email addresses abandoned, and their social media accounts either deleted or blocked from my access. The completeness of their disappearance was chilling in its premeditation and thoroughness. "It's like they just vanished into thin air," I told Dr. Reed during one of our phone conversations, my voice hollow with the realization of what I was facing. "They didn't just take Tommy away from me, they erased themselves from existence to make sure I could never find him." As the agonizing weeks stretched into months with no word about Tommy's whereabouts or well-being, I was forced to confront a truth so devastating that my mind had been protecting me from its full impact. Mark and Brenda hadn't acted out of genuine concern for Tommy's welfare or even simple selfishness. They had committed what amounted to kidnapping, deliberately isolating a vulnerable child from the only stable, loving home he had ever known, not because I was inadequate, but because caring for Tommy interfered with their plans for a carefree lifestyle. The realization that my own son was capable of such calculated cruelty toward both Tommy and me was like discovering that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. Mark wasn't just selfish or misguided. He was genuinely monstrous, willing to destroy a child's sense of security and an elderly woman's heart for the sake of his own convenience. How could I have raised someone capable of this? I asked myself repeatedly, searching through decades of memories for signs of the callousness that had been hidden beneath the surface of our relationship. What kind of mother was I that my son could grow up to be someone who would abandon his own child and torture his mother with such systematic cruelty? In the depths of my growing understanding of Mark's true character, a specific memory surfaced with painful clarity, a sacrifice I had made that demonstrated just how little my devotion meant to the people I had loved most. It was 3 years ago when Tommy's developmental specialists recommended a highly specialized therapy program that wasn't covered by any insurance and would cost nearly $40,000 over 6 months. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the estimate and calculating the impact on my retirement savings. I had been planning to use that money for a long dreamed of trip to Ireland, where my grandmother had been born, and perhaps a small investment property that would provide additional income during my golden years. But when I looked at Tommy's trusting face and thought about the potential this therapy represented for his communication skills and independence, there was no question about what I would do. I emptied my entire retirement account without telling Mark or anyone else about the sacrifice, simply saying I would find a way to pay for Tommy's treatment. For 6 months, I watched Tommy make remarkable progress with the specialized therapy, his vocabulary expanding, and his confidence growing in ways that brought tears of joy to my eyes. The money was worth every penny when I saw him successfully communicate his needs and wants for the first time, when he learned to express affection and form meaningful connections with the people around him. Now, knowing that Mark and Brenda had repaid my sacrifice by stealing Tommy away and condemning me as an inadequate caregiver, the memory felt like a knife twisting in an already mortal wound. My love and financial sacrifice had meant nothing to them, less than nothing, because they had used my advancing age as justification for their cruel actions. The cruelest blow came when my desperate need for some sign of Tommy's well-being led me to check Brenda's social media accounts from a friend's computer. What I found there was so callously cruel that it took my breath away and confirmed every worst suspicion about their motivations. Brenda's Instagram and Facebook pages were filled with meticulously curated posts showing her and Mark enjoying what they called their fresh start in their new state. Photos of expensive restaurant meals, a new luxury car weekend getaways to beach resorts, and carefree smiles that spoke of people who had successfully shed an unwanted burden. The most devastating post was a photo of Brenda raising a champagne glass in a toast with a caption that read, "Freedom tastes sweet." Sometimes you have to make hard choices to reclaim your life. Here's to new beginnings and endless possibilities. The image was accompanied by dozens of congratulatory comments from friends who clearly knew nothing about Tommy or the circumstances of their fresh start, celebrating Brenda's supposed triumph over unspecified challenges. The casual cruelty of turning Tommy's abandonment into a social media celebration was breathtaking in its heartlessness. Other posts showed Mark looking relaxed and happy in ways I hadn't seen since before Tommy was born, as if the absence of his son had lifted some terrible burden from his shoulders. The message was clear and deliberate. They were living their best lives now that they were free from the responsibilities of caring for a special needs child and maintaining a relationship with his devoted grandmother. But Brenda's public celebration of their escape wasn't the only threat I faced. Shirley, seeing my increasing isolation and emotional distress, began presenting herself as a concerned family member with my best interests at heart, while clearly positioning herself to take advantage of my vulnerability. "Carol, dear," she said, during one of her increasingly frequent visits, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I've been so worried about you since this whole situation with Tommy began. You seem so lost, so unable to cope with being alone after all these years of constant caregiving." Her suggestions began subtly, but became increasingly pointed. "I know of a lovely little assisted living community about an hour from here, very affordable with wonderful staff who specialize in helping people transition to a more manageable lifestyle. And I'd be happy to help you sort through your affairs, maybe help you sell this big house that's really too much for you to maintain alone." The implication was clear. Shirley saw my emotional crisis as an opportunity to convince me that I was incompetent to live independently, potentially gaining control over my property and finances while positioning herself as the caring family member who had stepped in to help during my time of need. The combination of Mark and Brenda's cruelty, the community's judgment, and Shirley's manipulative assistance created a perfect storm of abuse, designed to convince me that I was exactly what they claimed, an inadequate aging woman whose judgment could no longer be trusted. But they had underestimated the strength that comes from 40 years of fighting for children's welfare and the fury of a grandmother whose beloved grandson had been stolen by people who valued their own comfort over a child's need for love and stability. The pain was profound and endless, but underneath it, something harder and more determined was beginning to emerge. I was awakening to the pure malice that had been directed at both Tommy and me, and I was finally ready to fight back with every resource at my disposal. The legal letters began arriving with military precision, each one more intimidating and final than the last. The law firm representing Mark and Brenda clearly specialized in cutting off family relationships with the cold efficiency of a surgical procedure. Their letterhead alone enough to make my hands shake as I opened each new envelope. "Mrs. Carol Johnson," the first formal letter began, "our clients have authorized us to inform you that any continued attempts to contact them or locate the minor child, Tommy, will be considered harassment and stalking under state law. You have no legal standing as a caregiver or guardian, and your previous custodial arrangement was informal and temporary." The legal language was designed to intimidate and confuse, painting my 8 years of devoted care as something unofficial and illegitimate, as if the thousands of hours I had spent feeding, bathing, medicating, and loving Tommy had been some kind of extended babysitting arrangement, rather than the stable, nurturing home he had known since infancy. Furthermore, the letter continued with devastating precision. "Our clients have documented evidence of negligent care practices that place the minor child at risk. Any attempt to dispute these findings or interfere with the current placement will result in a restraining order and potential criminal charges for harassment and attempted interference with child welfare services." The threat was clear and terrifying. If I continued trying to find Tommy or challenge their version of events, I would face criminal prosecution for the crime of loving my grandson and refusing to accept his disappearance from my life. They were using the legal system as a weapon to formalize my banishment from Tommy's life and silence any opposition to their narrative. Subsequent letters arrived weekly, each one reinforcing the message that I was legally powerless and professionally discredited. They cited unnamed medical professionals who had supposedly raised concerns about my competency, educational specialists who had allegedly documented my inadequate support of Tommy's development, and family services personnel who had purportedly noted signs of emotional instability in my caregiving approach. The systematic nature of their legal assault was both impressive and terrifying. They hadn't just taken Tommy and disappeared. They had constructed an elaborate framework of supposed professional concern that painted me as exactly the kind of inadequate elderly caregiver that social services existed to protect children from. In my final, desperate attempt to reach whatever remained of the son I had raised and loved, I wrote a letter that came from the deepest part of my heart, recounting not accusations or demands, but memories of our shared history and the profound love that had sustained our family through every crisis we had faced together. My dearest Mark. I began my tears, making it difficult to see the words as I wrote them. I keep thinking about the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me pictures he had drawn at school, who told me I was the best mother in the world when I helped him with homework or comforted him after a nightmare. I wrote about the sacrifices we had both made for Tommy, the joy we had shared in his small victories, the way his presence had brought our family closer together during the early years when Mark had seemed genuinely committed to being a devoted father. I reminded him of Tommy's laughter, his trust, his innocent love for the people who had promised to protect him. I don't understand what has happened to the compassionate man who once cried when Tommy spoke his first clear word, who celebrated every tiny milestone as if it were a major achievement. I continued my handwriting, becoming increasingly unsteady as emotion overwhelmed me. That man would never abandon his son or break his mother's heart for the sake of convenience. Please, I'm begging you, remember who you used to be and bring our boy home where he belongs. The letter was returned to me unopened with a stamp indicating that delivery had been refused. Mark hadn't even bothered to read my words before rejecting them, demonstrating a level of indifference that made his previous cruelty seem almost merciful by comparison. The sight of my own handwriting on the returned envelope was like receiving confirmation of my complete erasure from their lives. The final, most insulting blow came during the holiday season when I received a generic Christmas card from Mark and Brenda that was so impersonal and dismissive that it felt like a deliberate mockery of everything we had once shared as a family. The card featured a stock photo of a winter landscape with no personal message beyond a printed, "Wishing you peace and independence during this holiday season." There was no mention of Tommy, no acknowledgement of my grief, no sign that they recognized me as anything more than a distant acquaintance deserving of basic seasonal courtesy. The card was signed only with their printed names, no handwritten note, no personal touch that would suggest any emotional connection or genuine feeling. Even more devastating was the absence of any sign from Tommy, no childish drawing or scribbled name that would prove he was safe and cared for in his new environment. The message was clear and deliberate. They had moved on completely from any relationship with me, and I was expected to accept my dismissal with grace and gratitude for their decision to maintain even this minimal level of contact. The card's emphasis on independence was particularly cruel, suggesting that my grief over losing Tommy was somehow unhealthy and that I should be celebrating my newfound freedom rather than mourning the destruction of my family. But in my darkest hour, driven by the desperate need to prove my competency and Tommy's well-being under my care, I turned to the meticulous records I had maintained throughout our 8 years together. As a retired school principal, documentation had been second nature to me, and I had applied the same professional standards to Tommy's care that I had once used to track student progress and family dynamics. What I discovered in my files was more powerful than any legal document or professional testimony. I had created an irrefutable archive of evidence that proved not only my competency as Tommy's caregiver, but his remarkable progress and happiness under my devoted care. The daily schedules I had maintained showed the structured, nurturing environment I had created for Tommy with carefully planned activities designed to support his development while respecting his need for routine and security. Medication logs documented my precise attention to his medical needs with never a missed dose or scheduling error in 8 years of complex treatment regimens. Therapy progress reports from every specialist who had worked with Tommy told the story of a child who was thriving under my care meeting and exceeding developmental goals while maintaining the emotional stability that comes from unconditional love and consistent support. The progression from his early struggles to his recent achievements was clearly documented and professionally validated. But the most powerful evidence was found in the hundreds of photos and short video clips I had taken to document Tommy's milestones and share his progress with his father during the periods when Mark's visits were infrequent. These images showed a happy, confident child who felt safe and loved, whose joy was evident in every smile, and whose trust in me was absolute and unwavering. Videos of Tommy successfully completing therapy exercises, proudly showing off new skills, and expressing affection for me through words and gestures provided undeniable proof that he had not only been well cared for, but had flourished under my devoted attention. The contrast between the thriving child in these recordings and the picture of neglect painted by Mark and Brenda was stark and undeniable. Most crucially, I found a treasure trove of written communications from Dr. Evelyn Reed, Tommy's primary therapist, who had consistently praised my caregiving abilities and expressed deep admiration for my dedication to Tommy's welfare. Her professional emails documented not just my competency, but my exceptional skill in supporting a special needs child's development. Carol is one of the most devoted and effective caregivers I have worked with in 20 years of practice. One email read, "Tommy's progress under her care has been remarkable, and the bond between them provides him with the emotional security that is essential for his continued development. Any concerns about her ability to provide appropriate care are completely unfounded." Another email sent just weeks before my surgery stated, "I want to personally thank you for the extraordinary care you provide for Tommy. Your attention to detail your advocacy for his needs and your unwavering love have created the ideal environment for his growth and happiness. Tommy is thriving because of your dedication, and any change in his care situation would be detrimental to his progress." This overwhelming evidence of my competency and Tommy's well-being under my care was the ultimate weapon against Mark and Brenda's lies. Every accusation they had made was contradicted by professional documentation. Every claim of inadequacy was refuted by objective evidence of Tommy's remarkable progress. But more than vindication for my reputation, these records represented hope for Tommy's future. If I could prove that he belonged with me, if I could demonstrate that his removal had been based on lies rather than legitimate concerns, perhaps there was still a chance to bring him home where he belonged. The evidence I had compiled was more than enough to challenge their narrative and expose their cruelty, but I knew that fighting back would require courage, resources, and allies who understood that this wasn't just about my rights as a grandmother, but about protecting a vulnerable child from people who valued their own convenience over his well-being. The war they had started was about to turn in my favor, and they were going to discover that stealing a child from a devoted grandmother who had spent 40 years fighting for children's welfare was the biggest mistake they would ever make. Armed with the overwhelming and undeniable evidence I had meticulously maintained over 8 years of devoted care, my profound grief underwent a transformation that surprised me with its completeness and steel-like strength. The devastated grandmother, who had been paralyzed by shock and disbelief, was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that she held the keys to justice in her hands and possessed both the moral authority and documented proof to use them effectively. The next morning, I contacted Harrison Mitchell and Associates, the most respected family law firm in the state, known specifically for their work in elder law and child advocacy cases. When I sat across from David Mitchell 2 days later, spreading Tommy's care records, Dr. Reed's testimonials, and hundreds of photos across his conference table, I felt an unshakable resolve that had been building in my chest like gathering storm clouds. "Mr. Mitchell." I said, my voice steady and clear, with purpose. "This isn't just about clearing my reputation or proving my competency as a caregiver. This is about a vulnerable child who has been stolen from the only stable, loving home he has ever known by people who view his special needs as an inconvenience to their lifestyle goals." David reviewed my documentation with growing amazement, occasionally pausing to examine specific therapy reports or study the progression shown in Tommy's photos. Mrs. Johnson, in 30 years of family law practice, I have rarely seen such comprehensive documentation of exceptional caregiving. This evidence doesn't just prove your competency, it demonstrates that Tommy was thriving under your care in ways that most professional facilities couldn't achieve. I looked at him with a clarity of purpose that felt almost foreign after months of confusion and helpless grief. "I want Tommy back where he belongs, and I want Mark and Brenda held accountable for what amounts to kidnapping and child abandonment. They have painted me as an incompetent elderly woman to justify their cruelty, and I intend to expose them for exactly what they are." My voice remained steady, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. They thought they could destroy an old woman's heart and steal a child's future because I would be too broken to fight back. They were wrong, and I intend to make sure they understand exactly how wrong they were. The formal legal notices demanding information about Tommy's whereabouts and current care situation were served to Mark and Brenda on a Tuesday afternoon through a process server who found them at their new apartment, apparently unprepared for any legal challenge to their carefully constructed new life. According to the server's report, their reaction was exactly what I had hoped to see. Mark's initial response, delivered through his hastily hired attorney, was a mixture of outrage and dismissive condescension that revealed how completely he had underestimated both my resolve and my resources. My client is shocked and deeply disappointed by Mrs. Johnson's continued harassment and her inability to accept that Tommy is receiving appropriate care from qualified professionals. His lawyer's statement read, "This appears to be the desperate action of an elderly woman who cannot accept that her informal caregiving arrangement was neither legally binding nor professionally adequate." Brenda's reaction, shared through mutual acquaintances who were eager to report back to me, was even more revealing of their fundamental miscalculation. "Carol is clearly having some kind of breakdown," she told anyone who would listen. "This whole legal nonsense is just the delusional fantasy of an old woman who doesn't know when to give up. We have every right to make decisions about Tommy's care, and these pathetic accusations won't change that." Their confidence in dismissing my legal action as the desperate flailing of a defeated woman would soon prove to be a catastrophic error in judgment that would cost them everything they thought they had gained by abandoning Tommy. While Mark and Brenda were confidently dismissing my legal challenge, I was methodically building an unassailable case with the help of professionals who understood the gravity of what had been done to both Tommy and me. Dr. Evelyn Reed's response to my call was immediate and filled with professional outrage. "Carol, what they've done is not just morally reprehensible, it's potentially criminal," she said during our meeting at her office. "Tommy was making remarkable progress under your care, and his sudden removal from the only stable environment he's ever known could cause severe psychological damage. I will provide whatever testimony and documentation you need to bring him home." I also began quietly reaching out to my network of former colleagues from my 40 years in education, respected administrators and teachers who had known me as a professional and could speak to my character and competency. The response was overwhelming and filled with indignation at the treatment I had received. Dr. Patricia Foster, who had served as superintendent when I was a principal, was appalled when I explained the situation. "Carol, anyone who worked with you knows your dedication to children's welfare and your exceptional professional standards. The idea that you would provide inadequate care to any child, let alone your beloved grandson, is absolutely ridiculous." Through carefully chosen intermediaries, I sent a message to Shirley that was both subtle and unmistakable in its implications. Through Martha Williams, a mutual friend who was increasingly disturbed by the evidence of Mark and Brenda's cruelty, I passed along a simple statement. "Please tell Shirley that I've always believed that the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully some people try to bury it under lies and gossip." The message had its intended effect. Within days, Shirley's confident spreading of rumors about my incompetency had changed to nervous inquiries about my legal proceedings and visible anxiety about her own role in the campaign against my reputation. But Mark's initial dismissive confidence quickly transformed into something much more desperate and threatening, as he realized that my legal challenge was serious and well documented. The threatening messages began arriving through his attorney, each one more aggressive and revealing than the last. "Mrs. Johnson needs to understand that pursuing this matter further will result in severe consequences for her reputation and financial security," one legal letter warned. "Our client has documented evidence of her declining mental state and inappropriate attachment to the minor child that could result in legal action for harassment and potential guardianship proceedings." Mark's personal messages, filtered through mutual acquaintances, were even more revealing of his desperation and underlying cruelty. "Tell Carol she's playing with fire," he told a former neighbor, who immediately reported the conversation to me. "If she doesn't drop this insanity, I will make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of unstable woman she really is. I have resources she can't imagine, and I won't hesitate to use them." Brenda joined the escalating campaign of intimidation with renewed vigor, creating new social media accounts specifically designed to spread lies about my supposed obsession with controlling Tommy and my inability to accept reality about his need for professional care. Posts appeared claiming I had been dangerously possessive of Tommy and had interfered with his proper medical treatment through my emotional manipulation of his care team. But their escalating threats and public attacks only strengthened my resolve and provided additional evidence for the harassment charges that David was preparing to file alongside our custody challenge. Every threatening message, every slanderous post, every attempt to intimidate me was carefully documented and added to our growing file of evidence. The liberation I felt was profound and intoxicating. For the first time in months, I was no longer a victim reacting to other people's cruelty. I was a woman with power, resources, and the moral authority of truth on my side, fighting not just for my own vindication, but for the welfare of a vulnerable child who needed an advocate. The quiet pride that filled me as I watched our case take shape was unlike anything I had experienced during my years of trying to maintain family harmony at any cost. I was no longer the grandmother desperately hoping for acceptance and approval from people who had never valued my sacrifices. A potent sense of justice was beginning to unfold, not just the hope of justice, but the growing certainty that it would be achieved. Mark and Brenda had made the fatal error of underestimating their opponent, believing that an elderly woman's love for her grandson would make her weak rather than recognizing it as the source of unshakable strength. The fierce determination I felt was entirely focused on Tommy's welfare and future. This wasn't about revenge or personal vindication anymore. It was about protecting a child who couldn't protect himself and ensuring that love and truth would triumph over greed and convenience. The war they had started was about to turn decisively in my favor, and I intended to show them no mercy whatsoever in my fight to bring Tommy home where he belonged. Working with David Mitchell and Dr. Reed, I spent the following weeks building a legal case that would not only challenge Mark and Brenda's custody of Tommy, but expose the full scope of their abandonment and false accusations with devastating precision. The formal custody and elder abuse lawsuit we filed was a masterpiece of legal strategy, systematically dismantling their narrative while presenting irrefutable evidence of both my exceptional care and their calculated cruelty. Mrs. Johnson, David explained during our case preparation meeting, we're not just challenging their right to make decisions about Tommy's care. We're documenting a pattern of child abandonment, elder abuse, and systematic defamation that constitutes criminal behavior. This case will set precedents for protecting both vulnerable children and elderly caregivers from family manipulation. The lawsuit cited specific instances of alleged neglect on Mark and Brenda's part, including their failure to maintain contact with Tommy's care team, their refusal to provide information about his current placement, and their systematic campaign to isolate him from his primary support system. Dr. Reed's professional testimony formed the backbone of our case. Her credentials and 20 years of experience with special needs children lending unshakable credibility to our claims. Tommy's progress under Carol's care was remarkable and well documented, Dr. Reed stated in her formal deposition. His removal from her care without proper transition planning or consideration for his emotional well-being constitutes a form of psychological abuse that could cause lasting damage to his development and sense of security. My major opportunity for public vindication came when I reconnected with Sarah Chen, one of my former students, who had become an investigative journalist for a major national newspaper. Sarah had specialized in stories about family abuse and children's welfare, and when she learned about my situation through our school's alumni network, she was both personally outraged and professionally fascinated. Mrs. Johnson, she said during our meeting at her newsroom, you taught me that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people don't want told. This isn't just about your family. It's about a form of elder and child abuse that happens more often than people realize. I want to investigate this thoroughly and expose what's really happening here. Sarah's professional credentials and reputation for ethical, thorough journalism would give our story the kind of national platform that no amount of legal maneuvering could achieve. The prospect of having Mark and Brenda's abandonment of Tommy exposed in the national media with all their lies and manipulations laid bare for millions to see was almost intoxicating in its promise of complete vindication. The opportunity to put our strategy into action came sooner than expected. The National Conference on Developmental Disabilities Advocacy was being held in Chicago, an event I had decided to attend to learn about resources and legal strategies for special needs families. What I didn't expect was to encounter Mark and Brenda at the same conference, clearly attempting to project an image of concerned, informed caregivers. I spotted them during the morning session on residential care options, sitting in the front row and taking notes with the dedication of people who wanted to be seen as actively engaged in Tommy's welfare. The irony was staggering. They were attending a conference about advocacy for disabled individuals while actively hiding a disabled child from his primary support system. The encounter was inevitable in the intimate setting of the conference break area. Mark noticed me first, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation as he realized this was an opportunity to continue his campaign of public manipulation. He approached with Brenda close behind both of them, wearing expressions of false concern and barely concealed hostility. "Oh, Mom," Mark said loudly enough for nearby conference attendees to hear his voice dripping with condescending sympathy that was designed to make me appear unstable and intrusive. "Still meddling in things that don't concern you. We're here for Tommy's best interests, trying to learn about the most advanced care options available. This isn't about your emotional drama or your need to control everything." His words were carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative he had been spreading about my supposed inability to accept professional judgment and my unhealthy attachment to a child who was supposedly better off without me. The suggestion that his attendance at the conference demonstrated superior commitment to Tommy's welfare was particularly cruel, given that he had provided no information about Tommy's current care or well-being. Brenda immediately joined the attack, positioning herself where other conference attendees could hear her stage whispers about my character and mental state. "It's really sad to watch someone's unhealthy obsession manifest in such destructive ways," she said in a voice that carried across the break area. "These delusional attempts to control Tommy's care are exactly why we had to make the difficult decision to place him in professional care. Carol just can't accept that her emotional attachment was interfering with his proper treatment." She continued her performance with the skill of someone who had been practicing this manipulation for months. "We're here learning about evidence-based care approaches and modern therapeutic techniques while she's still stuck in the past, thinking that grandmotherly love is enough to address serious developmental challenges. It's heartbreaking, really." I felt the familiar weight of public scrutiny and whispered judgment, but this time the sensation was completely different from the helpless humiliation I had experienced during their initial campaign against me. I was no longer a victim without resources or options. I was a woman armed with truth, legal power, and professional allies who understood exactly what Mark and Brenda were attempting to do. Instead of engaging in the verbal confrontation, they were clearly hoping to provoke, which would have made me appear emotional and unstable to the professional audience around us. I simply stood calmly and nodded to David Mitchell, who had accompanied me to the conference specifically for this kind of situation. "Mark Johnson and Brenda Johnson," David said in a clear, authoritative voice that immediately commanded the attention of everyone within hearing range. "You are hereby served with subpoenas for deposition in the matter of Johnson versus Johnson regarding custody arrangements and care decisions for the minor child Tommy Johnson." The legal documents appeared in David's hands with dramatic efficiency, and the sight of official court seals and formal language created an immediate electric silence in the conference break area. The transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, Mark and Brenda were no longer the concerned parents sharing expertise at a professional conference. They were defendants in serious legal proceedings, caught completely off guard and clearly unprepared for the reality of facing actual legal consequences. You are also served with a court order requiring the production of all medical records, care documentation, and facility information related to Tommy Johnson's current placement. David continued with professional satisfaction. Failure to comply with this order within 10 days will result in contempt of court charges and potential criminal prosecution for child endangerment. The impact on the assembled conference attendees was immediate and profound. These were professionals who specialized in child advocacy and family support services, people who understood the serious nature of custody disputes and the legal frameworks designed to protect vulnerable children. The sight of official court documents being served at a conference dedicated to children's welfare created a buzz of professional interest and concern. Mark's face went through a remarkable transformation as he processed what was happening. The confident smirk he had worn since approaching me crumbled into genuine fear and confusion as he understood that his supposed legal superiority was about to be challenged by evidence he had never known existed. Brenda's carefully constructed performance of concerned parenting dissolved into visible panic as she realized that their narrative of professional competence versus grandmotherly interference was about to be examined by legal authorities who had access to objective evidence and professional testimony. The whispered conversations that erupted around us were no longer about my supposed instability or obsession, but about the serious legal implications of what appeared to be a case involving the welfare of a special needs child and questions about proper care arrangements. The anticipation I felt was delicious and profound, watching months of careful legal preparation come together in a moment of perfect public vindication. The satisfaction was complete as I saw Mark and Brenda suddenly understand that they were no longer in control of the narrative that the grieving grandmother they had thought they could manipulate, and silence was actually a formidable opponent with resources and allies they had never imagined. This was just the beginning of their education about the consequences of underestimating Carol Johnson. The triumph I felt was absolute and unshakable, built on the solid foundation of truth and justice that they could never successfully challenge. The quiet vindication of that moment was worth every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of doubt I had endured since Tommy's disappearance. The war had turned decisively in my favor, and they were finally beginning to understand what it felt like to be afraid. Building on the public humiliation of serving the subpoenas at the Disabilities Conference, David and I moved to consolidate our legal advantage with the systematic precision of experienced advocates who understood that protecting vulnerable children required decisive action. The evidence we had compiled wasn't just sufficient for a custody challenge. It provided grounds for a criminal investigation into child endangerment and abandonment that could result in serious legal consequences for Mark and Brenda. Mrs. Johnson, Detective Lisa Rodriguez, explained during our meeting at the police station the deliberate concealment of a special needs child's whereabouts, combined with the systematic campaign to discredit his primary caregiver, meets the legal definition of child endangerment. The evidence you've provided gives us more than enough grounds for a full criminal investigation. Dr. Reed's professional testimony was particularly powerful in establishing that Tommy's sudden removal from my care without proper transition planning constituted a form of psychological abuse that could cause lasting developmental damage. Children with special needs require stability and consistency in their care relationships, she explained in her formal statement to investigators. The abrupt termination of Tommy's primary attachment relationship without regard for his emotional well-being represents a serious breach of his fundamental right to appropriate care. The knowledge that Mark and Brenda were now facing potential criminal charges added a new dimension to our legal strategy. This wasn't just about reclaiming custody of Tommy anymore. It was about ensuring that their abandonment and false accusations were exposed and punished in a way that would protect other vulnerable children and elderly caregivers from similar abuse. But Mark and Brenda were not prepared to surrender without a fight, and their desperation led them to escalate their attacks in ways that ultimately provided additional evidence for our harassment case. Brenda, realizing that their confident dismissal of my legal action had been a catastrophic miscalculation, launched into a frenzied campaign of character assassination that revealed the true depth of her malice and vindictiveness. Working through newly created fake social media accounts and anonymous online platforms, Brenda began spreading increasingly outrageous lies about my supposed history of child abuse and professional misconduct. Posts appeared on parenting forums claiming I had physically abused Tommy during care routines, that I had mismanaged his medications to keep him dependent, and that I had been investigated for inappropriate relationships with students during my career as a school principal. The truth about Carol Johnson is finally coming out, one particularly vicious post read. She's been running this control game for years, using her position as an educator to manipulate vulnerable families and steal children from their rightful parents. Tommy wasn't her first victim, and if she gets away with this custody grab, he won't be her last. Shirley eagerly joined Brenda's campaign, spreading her own version of the lies through local networks and social media groups. I've known Carol for years. She posted on our town's community Facebook page, and I always had concerns about her relationship with that poor child. She was possessive and controlling, never letting his parents make normal parenting decisions. It's actually a relief that Tommy is finally getting proper professional care. The desperation in their attacks was obvious to anyone with experience in observing criminal behavior, but their lies were sophisticated enough to create doubt among people who didn't know me personally or understand the documented evidence of my exceptional care. But Brenda and Shirley had made a fatal error in their escalation. By creating such extreme and easily disprovable accusations, they had given Sarah Chen exactly the kind of explosive story that investigative journalists dream of uncovering. When Sarah's article appeared in the Sunday edition of the national newspaper, it was devastating in its thoroughness and compelling in its presentation of evidence. Grandmother's Fight, the true story behind a special needs child's disappearance, read the headline, accompanied by a photo of Tommy and me during one of his therapy sessions, both of us smiling with the joy of a successful breakthrough. The article systematically dismantled every aspect of Mark and Brenda's narrative while presenting our evidence with the kind of professional credibility that no amount of social media manipulation could overcome. The most powerful section of the article featured direct video clips embedded in the online version showing Tommy thriving under my care. Readers could see him successfully completing therapy exercises, expressing affection for me through words and gestures, and demonstrating the remarkable progress he had made in communication and independence. The contrast between the happy, confident child in these recordings and the picture of neglect painted by Mark and Brenda was stark and undeniable. Dr. Reed's professional testimony was presented with detailed explanations of Tommy's developmental achievements and the specialized care techniques I had mastered to support his growth. Carol Johnson provided Tommy with the kind of individualized, loving care that most professional facilities couldn't match. Dr. Reed was quoted extensively. His progress under her care was remarkable, and his sudden removal has likely caused severe psychological trauma. The article also included a comprehensive section exposing Brenda and Shirley's social media campaign with screenshots of their fake accounts and detailed analysis of their coordinated attacks on my character. The systematic nature of this harassment campaign suggests a level of premeditation and malice that goes far beyond normal family disagreement, Sarah wrote. This appears to be a calculated attempt to destroy an innocent woman's reputation in order to cover up their own abandonment of a vulnerable child. But perhaps most damaging to Mark and Brenda was the article's detailed timeline of events, showing how their claims of concern for Tommy's welfare were contradicted by their own actions. While claiming to seek the best care for Tommy, Mark and Brenda Johnson have refused to provide any information about his current placement, have cut off all communication with his medical team, and have actively prevented his grandmother from having any contact with him. The article documented with devastating precision. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming in its condemnation of Mark, Brenda, and Shirley's behavior. Comments flooded the newspaper's website and social media pages with expressions of outrage at their abandonment of a special needs child and sympathy for what I had endured. How could anyone be so cruel to a vulnerable child and his devoted grandmother? Thank God she had the strength to fight back against these monsters. This is exactly why we need stronger laws to protect children and elderly caregivers from family abuse. The social and professional consequences for Mark, Brenda, and Shirley were swift and devastating. Mark's employer, a regional accounting firm, placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, citing concerns about his demonstrated lack of ethical judgment in family matters and the potential liability of employing someone under investigation for child endangerment. Brenda's social media accounts were shut down by the platforms themselves after being flooded with reports of harassment and false information. Her reputation in their new community was destroyed before it had even been established, as neighbors and acquaintances who had initially welcomed them now viewed them with suspicion and disgust. Shirley faced the complete collapse of her social standing in our hometown, as people who had initially believed her gossip about my incompetency now understood that she had been actively participating in a campaign to cover up child abandonment. Her church asked her to step down from her volunteer positions, and several longtime friends publicly distanced themselves from her obvious lies and manipulation. But the most satisfying consequence was the complete reversal of public opinion regarding my character and my legal fight. People who had initially been influenced by the gossip and rumors were now apologizing for their hasty judgments and expressing admiration for my courage in fighting back against such systematic abuse. David's follow-up statement to the media provided the final blow to any remaining sympathy for Mark and Brenda. In 30 years of family law practice, I have rarely encountered such a calculated and malicious campaign of child abandonment disguised as concern for welfare, he stated during a televised interview. We will be seeking maximum criminal prosecution and civil damages to ensure that Tommy is returned to his loving home and that this kind of abuse is deterred in the future. The calculated satisfaction I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This was complete and total vindication, the absolute destruction of people who had tried to destroy both Tommy and me for their own selfish convenience, and the public recognition that we were the victims of criminal behavior rather than a bitter family dispute. I had achieved ultimate power in this situation, the ability to use truth and legal authority to completely reverse the narrative and expose those who had wronged us for exactly what they were. Mark, Brenda, and Shirley had lost not just their legal case, but their reputations, their social standing, and their freedom from criminal prosecution. The fierce hope I felt for Tommy's return was now backed by the full force of law enforcement public opinion and professional advocacy. The war was almost over, and I had won more decisively than I had ever dared to hope possible. But most importantly, Tommy would soon be coming home where he belonged. 4 months had passed since Sarah's devastating article appeared, and the legal machinery was grinding forward with the relentless efficiency of justice finally being served. Mark faced multiple criminal charges, including child endangerment and obstruction of justice, while Brenda had been named as a co-conspirator in both the abandonment and the defamation campaign. The court had issued warrants for their immediate compliance with custody orders, and law enforcement was actively searching for Tommy's location. Private investigators hired by David had traced Mark and Brenda to 3 different states as they attempted to stay ahead of the legal consequences of their actions. Their new lifestyle of freedom and luxury had collapsed into a desperate flight from justice, with frozen assets, destroyed reputations, and the growing certainty that they would face serious prison time for their crimes against both Tommy and me. It was on a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after Tommy's disappearance, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something in my gut told me exactly who it was before I answered, and when I heard Mark's voice, I was struck by how completely he had changed from the confident manipulator who had stolen my grandson and attempted to destroy my life. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling with a mixture of desperation, anger, and barely controlled panic that revealed the complete collapse of his comfortable world. "You have to stop this insanity. You're completely ruining my life over nothing. I've lost my job. Brenda's lost her job. We can't go anywhere without people recognizing us from the news. This has all gone way too far, and you need to drop these ridiculous charges right now." The transformation in his tone was remarkable and deeply satisfying. The man who had once dismissed me as a delusional old woman was now pleading with the desperate voice of someone whose calculated cruelty had finally met its match in the legal system. "I never meant any real harm to Tommy or to you. The placement thing was just a family disagreement that got out of hand. You're treating this like we committed some kind of serious crime when it was really just poor judgment and miscommunication." I listened to his frantic words with a calm detachment that surprised me with its completeness. The woman who had once been desperate for Mark's approval and love, who had spent decades hoping to build some kind of meaningful relationship with this man, was gone entirely. In her place was someone who recognized Mark for exactly what he was, a person whose capacity for empathy and human decency had been permanently corrupted by selfishness and entitlement. "Mark," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the emotional vulnerability that had once made me susceptible to his manipulation. "The consequences you're facing are the direct result of your own choices and your calculated campaign of abandonment and cruelty toward Tommy and me. You didn't commit poor judgment. You committed criminal acts designed to steal my grandson and destroy my reputation." I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle into the silence between us. "Every legal action I've taken has been in response to your decision to hide Tommy from his medical team, lie to authorities about his care, and engage in a systematic campaign of defamation and intimidation. These criminal charges are simply the natural consequences of criminal behavior. My voice remained professional and matter of fact, as if I were explaining a disciplinary action to a student, rather than speaking to someone who had once been my son. My pursuit of justice through the legal system is completely non-negotiable. You chose to abandon a vulnerable child and betray his primary caregiver's trust, and now you must face the full consequences of those choices. I could hear his breathing change on the other end of the line, becoming more rapid and shallow, as he realized that his attempts at emotional manipulation were falling on completely deaf ears. When he spoke again, his entire approach had shifted from angry demands to pathetic begging that revealed the true weakness beneath his previous cruelty. "Mom, please, I'm begging you," he said, his voice taking on a wheedling, desperate quality that was both pitiful and disgusting. "I know I made mistakes, but this punishment is completely out of proportion to what I did. The legal fees are bankrupting us, and the criminal charges are going to destroy our entire future. We'll lose everything we've worked for our whole lives." The desperation in his voice was genuine, but it only served to highlight the complete absence of remorse or understanding about the impact of his actions on Tommy's well-being and my own suffering. Mark wasn't sorry for what he had done to us. He was only sorry that he was facing consequences for his criminal behavior. Then came the moment I had been unconsciously waiting for since this entire nightmare began, the revelation that would strip away any remaining pretense about his character and motivations. Mark's voice shifted slightly, taking on the calculating tone I remembered from his previous attempts at financial manipulation throughout his adult life. "Look, I know you've probably gotten some kind of settlement or compensation from the legal proceedings," he said, attempting to sound casual while obviously fishing for information about my financial resources. "And I know you were always good at managing money and investments. Maybe we could work something out, family, helping family during a difficult time." The audacity was breathtaking, even for Mark. After stealing Tommy from the only loving home he had ever known, after conducting a months-long campaign to destroy my reputation and isolate me from my community, after forcing me to spend my retirement savings on legal fees to fight for basic justice, he was actually trying to get money from me to pay for his defense against the criminal charges resulting from his own actions. "I mean, we're still family, right?" he continued with increasingly transparent manipulation, and I could hear Brenda's voice in the background clearly coaching him through this final desperate attempt. "Tommy would want us to stick together during tough times like this. Maybe this could be a chance for a fresh start, a way for all of us to put this whole mess behind us and move forward. I promise things would be different if you could just help us get through this rough patch." The pathetic nature of his begging was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. Mark genuinely seemed to believe that the same financial manipulation tactics that had characterized his relationship with me throughout his adult life could somehow save him from the legal consequences of child abandonment and elder abuse. I felt a profound sense of emotional detachment wash over me, as if I were observing this conversation from a great distance. The man on the other end of the phone was no longer my son in any meaningful sense, no longer someone who held any emotional power over me or deserved any consideration as a family member. He was simply a criminal trying to avoid the consequences of his actions through the same manipulation tactics that had enabled his parasitic behavior for decades. "Mark," I said with absolute finality, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had reclaimed complete control over her own life and future. The relationship I tried to build with you over 40 years was irrevocably destroyed by your abandonment of Tommy and your monstrous campaign of lies designed to cover up your own selfishness and cruelty. I paused, gathering my thoughts for what I knew would be my final words to the man who had once been the center of my hopes for family connection and love. Your systematic campaign to steal Tommy and destroy my reputation was not a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated criminal conspiracy that revealed the true nature of your character and your complete lack of respect for the most vulnerable members of our family. My voice remained steady and professional, but the finality in it was unmistakable. All future communication between us will be conducted solely through legal channels. My attorney has instructions to handle any attempts at contact, and I am blocking your number and all other means of reaching me immediately after this call. I felt a profound sense of liberation as I delivered the words that would end our relationship forever. Consider this the final absolute conclusion of any connection between us. You are no longer welcome in my life in any capacity whatsoever, and when Tommy comes home, you will have no place in his life either. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked Mark's number, then sat in my quiet living room feeling a sense of detachment, empowerment, and ultimate relief that was almost overwhelming in its completeness. The toxic relationship that had drained my emotional energy for decades was finally definitively over. The peace I felt was impenetrable and lasting, built on the solid foundation of justice achieved and truth vindicated. Mark and Brenda no longer had any power over me, any ability to manipulate my emotions or threaten my security or Tommy's welfare. I had reclaimed complete control over my life, my home, and my future as Tommy's devoted grandmother. For the first time since Tommy's disappearance, I felt genuinely free, liberated not just from their criminal conspiracy, but from the burden of hoping for redemption from people who were fundamentally incapable of change or growth. The war was over, and I had achieved something far more valuable than victory. I had achieved the peace that comes from knowing that justice would be served, and that Tommy would soon be coming home where he belonged. 18 months after Mark's final desperate phone call, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those dark days when I had stood helpless and heartbroken, watching my grandson disappear from my life. The successful prosecution of Mark and Brenda's crimes had not only brought Tommy home to me, but had established me as a nationally recognized voice in the fight for disabled children's rights and protection of elderly caregivers. The invitation to serve as keynote speaker at the National Children's Advocacy Gala was the pinnacle of my new role as an advocate and educator. Standing before an audience of 500 philanthropists, legislators, and child welfare professionals in the grand ballroom of the Roosevelt Hotel, I felt a profound sense of purpose that had emerged from the ashes of my personal tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, I said into the microphone, my voice steady and authoritative, as I looked out at the sea of faces that included senators, judges, and leaders of major charitable foundations. The abandonment of vulnerable children by their own families is not just a personal tragedy, it's a societal failure that demands our collective action. When those who should protect the most defenseless among us choose convenience over compassion, we must be prepared to stand as their guardians and advocates. I was midway through describing the legal reforms needed to protect special needs children and their caregivers when I noticed a commotion near the back of the ballroom. Security guards were trying to prevent someone from entering, but a familiar voice was growing louder and more agitated with each passing moment, cutting through the elegant atmosphere like a discordant note. My heart sank when I recognized Shirley's voice, shrill with desperation and barely controlled rage, as she pushed past the event staff and made her way toward the stage. She looked haggard and wild, her appearance reflecting months of social isolation, financial strain, and the gradual collapse of everything she had once considered secure in her comfortable, gossipy existence. The sight of her filled me with a mixture of dread and profound sadness. Shirley had been consumed by her own malice and jealousy, destroyed by her participation in Mark and Brenda's campaign of cruelty, and now she was about to humiliate herself in front of the most influential child advocacy professionals in the country. "That's enough lies," Shirley screamed as she reached the front of the ballroom, her voice cracking with emotion that silenced the entire audience of distinguished guests. "I can't sit here and listen to this fraud spread more lies about herself." Her words echoed through the elegant space, creating a stark contrast between the sophisticated setting and the raw desperation of her outburst. The 500 attendees, many of whom had paid thousands of dollars to attend this prestigious fundraising event, sat in stunned silence as they witnessed what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. Before security could reach her, Shirley had somehow managed to approach the podium area, her voice now carrying throughout the ballroom as she launched into the most unhinged public attack I had ever witnessed from her. "She's a fake and a fraud who used her disabled grandson for sympathy and attention," Shirley shrieked, pointing directly at me with a shaking finger that trembled with years of accumulated envy and resentment. Carol Johnson is a selfish old woman who destroyed her own son's life because she couldn't accept that Tommy needed professional care instead of her amateur grandmotherly interference. Her accusations tumbled out in an incoherent stream of rage and desperation, each claim more outrageous than the last. She manipulated the legal system and the media to paint herself as a victim when she was really a controlling, possessive woman who used that poor child to make herself feel important. She ruined Mark's life, destroyed his marriage, and turned everyone against him with her lies and her manufactured evidence. The audience was stunned into collective silence, unsure how to process this shocking interruption to what had been a prestigious charity event. I could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes suddenly filled with doubt and confusion, uncertain whether they were witnessing the exposure of a fraud or the desperate breakdown of someone whose own lies had finally caught up with her. Some attendees who were unfamiliar with the details of my case began whispering among themselves, clearly influenced by the raw emotion and apparent conviction in Shirley's accusations. Could there be some truth to this? Why would she risk this kind of public scene if it wasn't real? Maybe there's more to this story than we know. The familiar sensation of public humiliation washed over me, magnified by the prestigious setting and the high stakes of my reputation as a national advocate. These were the most influential people in child welfare and philanthropy, individuals whose support was crucial for protecting vulnerable children across the country. And now my credibility was being attacked in the most public and devastating way possible. But something fundamental had changed within me during the months of legal victory, Tommy's return, and my emergence as a respected advocate. Instead of crumbling under the weight of this renewed attack, instead of feeling the familiar helplessness that had once characterized my response to family manipulation, I felt the same steady calm that had carried me through every challenge since deciding to fight for Tommy's welfare. I stood tall behind the podium, my gaze remaining steady and unshakable as I absorbed the full impact of Shirley's desperate accusations. I could see the pain and desperation radiating from her, could recognize the sophisticated manipulation she was attempting, but I also understood that she had just made a fatal tactical error in front of the worst possible audience for her lies. With quiet dignity, I allowed Shirley to continue her unhinged rant, letting her expose the full extent of her irrationality and malice for everyone in the room to witness. I subtly signaled to the security team to ensure that her outburst was being properly documented, and I noticed with satisfaction that several major news outlets had camera crews present who were capturing every moment of her breakdown. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said calmly into my microphone when Shirley finally paused for breath, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom with the authority of someone who had been tested by far worse attacks than this. "What you're witnessing is exactly what I've been describing. This is what desperation looks like when people who have built their lives on gossip and malice finally face the consequences of their actions." I looked directly at Shirley as I spoke, my voice filled with quiet sadness, but completely devoid of anger or fear. This individual participated in a campaign to hide a disabled child from his loving family and destroy the reputation of his devoted caregiver. Her appearance here tonight represents a final, desperate attempt to salvage a reputation that has been destroyed by her own choices and cruelty. The profound sense of control I felt was unlike anything I had experienced during my years of trying to maintain family harmony and avoid conflict at any cost. I was no longer a victim reacting to other people's malice. I was a woman with unshakable moral authority and a documented history of fighting for children's welfare against those who would exploit them. Security finally reached Shirley and began gently but firmly escorting her from the ballroom, her voice becoming increasingly shrill and incoherent as she was removed from the premises. The contrast between her wild desperation and my calm, dignified response was not lost on the sophisticated audience of child welfare professionals who understood exactly what they had just witnessed. As the ballroom returned to quiet, I felt a surge of suppressed rage at Shirley's continued attempts to destroy my reputation and undermine my advocacy work. But I also felt a calculated determination to use this moment as the final decisive blow against the last remnant of the conspiracy that had tried to destroy Tommy and me. The intense public humiliation of having my keynote address disrupted by a screaming woman making wild accusations was profound, but underneath it was an unshakable confidence that this attack would backfire spectacularly on its perpetrator. Shirley had just exposed herself as exactly the kind of malicious, unstable person I had always described her as being, and she had done it in front of the most credible witnesses possible. The war was about to end with a victory so complete and decisive that no one would ever again question my integrity or my commitment to protecting vulnerable children like Tommy. The 24 hours following Shirley's catastrophic disruption of the National Children's Advocacy Gala were among the most strategically important of my entire campaign for justice and child protection. While other people might have retreated to recover from such a public attack, I immediately understood that Shirley had just handed me the perfect opportunity for final comprehensive victory in front of a national audience. David Mitchell. Dr. Reed and I worked through the night to prepare what would become the most influential media event of our entire fight for Tommy and against family abuse. The press conference we scheduled for the following afternoon would not just respond to Shirley's desperate accusations, it would systematically expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had tried to destroy both Tommy and me while establishing new standards for protecting vulnerable children and elderly caregivers. Carol David said during our emergency strategy session, his voice filled with the excitement of a lawyer who recognized a perfect opportunity for legal and social justice. Shirley's public breakdown last night was the best thing that could have happened for our advocacy work. She just demonstrated her complete irrationality and malice in front of 500 of the most influential people in child welfare, and it was all captured on national television. Dr. Reed nodded her agreement, her professional authority adding weight to our cause. The contrast between your dignified response and her unhinged accusations was striking to anyone with experience in family dynamics and child protection. Every professional in that room could see immediately who was fighting for a child's welfare and who was motivated by personal spite. The press conference was held at the National Press Club, a setting that would lend additional gravity and credibility to our revelations. But this time, we weren't just defending against individual attacks. We were launching a comprehensive offensive that would expose every aspect of the conspiracy against Tommy and establish my voice as a permanent force in child advocacy. Standing behind the podium with David at my side and Dr. Reed's unwavering professional support, I felt the same calm, focused energy that had carried me through every challenge since Tommy's disappearance. This was my moment to go on the offensive for the final time, to systematically dismantle every lie that had been told about my family and ensure that my painful experience would protect other vulnerable families. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice clear and authoritative as cameras from major news networks focused on my face. Last night, you witnessed the desperate final act of a conspiracy that began with the abandonment of a disabled child and escalated into a systematic campaign of elder abuse, defamation, and obstruction of justice. Today, I want to show you exactly how that conspiracy was orchestrated and why the protection of vulnerable children and their caregivers must become a national priority. I reached for the first piece of evidence, a forensically verified collection of text messages and social media posts that our investigators had compiled over months of detailed work. These are communications between Shirley Porter, my cousin, and Mark and Brenda Johnson, showing their coordination in spreading lies about my competency as Tommy's caregiver and their systematic campaign to isolate him from his support system. The screens behind me displayed the damning evidence as I spoke, showing Shirley's enthusiastic participation in creating false narratives about my supposed inadequacy and her active role in spreading malicious gossip throughout our community. The messages revealed not just her complicity, but her genuine enjoyment of the harm she was causing. What you're seeing is not just family disagreement or different perspectives on caregiving. I continued my voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the evidence. This is documented proof of a calculated campaign to hide a vulnerable child and destroy the reputation of his devoted caregiver for the sake of convenience and spite. But the most powerful moment came when I addressed Shirley's accusations directly using the comprehensive documentation I had maintained throughout Tommy's care to systematically demolish every lie she had ever told about our family. Shirley Porter claimed last night that I was a fraud who used Tommy for attention and sympathy. I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose integrity had been tested and proven in court. The evidence tells a different story entirely. I activated the large screen behind me to show video clips of Tommy thriving under my care, his progress documented by medical professionals, and his happiness evident in every smile and successful therapy session. These recordings, taken over 8 years of devoted care, show a child who was not being exploited or manipulated, but who was receiving the kind of individualized, loving attention that enabled him to reach his full potential. The contrast between the happy, confident child in these videos and the picture of neglect and manipulation painted by Shirley was stark and undeniable. Every accusation she had made was contradicted by objective evidence of Tommy's remarkable progress and emotional security under my care. Dr. Reed, I continued turning to invite her professional testimony. Would you please explain to the media what Shirley Porter's accusations reveal about her understanding of special needs, care, and child welfare? Dr. Reed stepped forward with the authority of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable children. Shirley Porter's claims about Carol's motives and methods demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the therapeutic relationship between caregiver and child. She said clearly, "The evidence shows that Tommy made remarkable progress under Carol's care precisely because she provided the emotional security and individualized attention that he needed to thrive." She continued with devastating precision. The suggestion that Carol's advocacy for Tommy was somehow selfish or attention-seeking reveals a disturbing lack of understanding about what children with special needs require from their primary caregivers. Carol's fight to bring Tommy home was motivated by love and professional knowledge, not by personal gain. I looked directly into the cameras, knowing that Shirley would likely see this broadcast, knowing that this would be the final word on her pathetic attempts to destroy my reputation and undermine my advocacy work. Shirley Porter has spent 18 months trying to convince people that my love for Tommy was somehow unhealthy or manipulative. I said my voice remaining steady but carrying unmistakable emotional weight. The evidence speaks for itself about who was fighting for a child's welfare and who was motivated by jealousy and spite. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming in its condemnation of Shirley and vindication of my position. Social media exploded with outrage at her behavior, with comments flooding in from parents and advocates horrified by her cruelty toward both a disabled child and his devoted grandmother. This woman is a monster for attacking someone who fought so hard for a vulnerable child. Carol Johnson is a hero and an inspiration to every family dealing with special needs. Shirley Porter should be ashamed of herself for participating in such cruelty. Major news outlets picked up the story within hours, with headlines focusing on Shirley's shocking vindictiveness and the broader implications for protecting vulnerable families. Family conspirators exposed in National Child Advocacy case. The true cost of elder abuse. How spite nearly destroyed a disabled child's future. Grandmother's victory. A new model for protecting special needs families. But the most satisfying development came when news broke during the press conference itself about the final legal consequences for Mark and Brenda. David received a text message from our legal team and stepped forward to announce the conclusion of their criminal cases. I've just received word that Mark Johnson has been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for child endangerment and obstruction of justice, David announced to the assembled media. Brenda Johnson has received 12 months and substantial financial penalties for her role in the conspiracy. Both have been ordered to pay significant restitution to Mrs. Johnson for the emotional distress and financial costs they caused through their criminal actions. The news of their convictions provided the perfect capstone to our press conference, demonstrating that justice had not only been served, but that the legal system now recognized the serious nature of crimes against vulnerable children and elderly caregivers. Shirley's already destroyed reputation was utterly annihilated by the comprehensive exposure of her malice and the revelation of her legal complicity in child endangerment. She became the subject of academic case studies about elder abuse and family manipulation, her name permanently associated with one of the most documented cases of conspiracy against vulnerable family members in recent legal history. The social and professional consequences for Shirley were swift and permanent. Her remaining social connections evaporated as people understood the full scope of her cruelty. Her church formally expelled her from membership, and she was forced to leave town entirely to escape the universal condemnation of her behavior. Standing there in the aftermath of the press conference, watching reporters rush to file their stories, and feeling the weight of national opinion shift decisively toward protection and justice for vulnerable families, I experienced a sense of vindication so complete and overwhelming that it felt almost spiritual in its intensity. This wasn't just about clearing my name or reclaiming my grandson anymore. This was about exposing a form of abuse that was largely invisible and rarely prosecuted, using my personal trauma to create awareness and protection that would help other families facing similar manipulation and abandonment. The exhilarating sense of justice was profound and lasting. Shirley, Mark, and Brenda had finally been revealed for exactly what they were, their methods exposed. Their cruelty documented, their influence destroyed permanently and completely. But more than personal vindication, I had found my true calling as an advocate and educator, transforming my suffering into a powerful force for protecting other vulnerable children and their devoted caregivers. The triumph I felt was both personal and universal. The satisfaction of a woman who had refused to be destroyed by those who underestimated her strength, and the pride of someone who had used her pain to create something meaningful and protective for others. The overwhelming joy I felt wasn't just about my own victory. It was about the knowledge that Tommy was safe, that other families would be better protected, and that the love and sacrifice of devoted caregivers would be recognized and legally defended for generations to come. 2.5 years had passed since the press conference that had definitively ended Shirley's ability to threaten or intimidate anyone, and had established new legal precedents for protecting vulnerable children and their caregivers. Mark had served his full sentence and was now facing the challenge of rebuilding a life with a criminal record and a reputation destroyed by his own choices. Brenda had divorced him during his incarceration and disappeared entirely from our lives. Tommy and I had settled into a peaceful routine in our restored home, surrounded by the love and support of genuine friends and fellow advocates who understood the precious nature of our bond. The rooms that had once echoed with the loneliness of his absence now rang with his laughter, his questions, and the joy of watching him continue to grow and thrive under the care that had always been his birthright. It was on a gray November afternoon, exactly 3 years after Tommy's return, when I heard the familiar sound of hesitant footsteps on the front porch. Through the window, I could see a figure that was barely recognizable as the confident manipulator who had once stolen my grandson and attempted to destroy my life for his own convenience. Mark stood there, looking broken, gaunt, and utterly defeated, his appearance reflecting not just the legal consequences he had faced, but the complete collapse of everything he had once believed about his place in the world. His clothes were shabby, his posture reflected deep shame, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had discovered that actions truly do have consequences. When I opened the door, Mark immediately collapsed into what appeared to be genuine tears, his whole body shaking with the force of emotions he seemed unable to control. But even in his apparent distress, I could see the calculating desperation of someone who was still, even now, attempting to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking with what sounded like authentic remorse, but carried undertones of practiced manipulation. "I know I have no right to be here, but I had nowhere else to go. Prison was hell, but this is worse. I can't get a job. I can't rent an apartment. I can't even get basic services because of my record. Everyone knows what I did, and they treat me like a monster." The sight of Mark in such obvious distress triggered no maternal instincts whatsoever, only a calm detachment that reflected the profound healing I had undergone during our years of separation and the joy of watching Tommy flourish under proper care. I had learned to recognize manipulation in all its forms, and Mark's performance, while more sophisticated than his previous attempts, was still transparently self-serving. "I know now that what I did was wrong," he continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this speech during countless sleepless nights in prison. "I've had a lot of time to think about my actions, and I understand how much pain I caused you and Tommy. I was consumed by selfishness and resentment that had nothing to do with either of you and everything to do with my own failures and inadequacies." He looked up at me with eyes that reflected genuine desperation, but still lacked any trace of authentic understanding about the impact of his actions on Tommy's well-being and development. "I want to make amends, Mom. I want to be part of Tommy's life again, to be the father he deserves, and the son you raised me to be. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe we could start over, maybe find a way to be a family again." Mark's appeal to family connection was particularly transparent, given that he had spent years rejecting every attempt I had made to build that exact relationship. His sudden interest in being a devoted father was clearly motivated by desperation rather than genuine remorse or emotional growth. "I've been going to therapy and anger management classes," he added, pulling out what appeared to be certificates from court-mandated programs. "I'm learning about my abandonment issues and my problems with authority and family relationships. The counselor says I projected my fear of responsibility onto Tommy unfairly, that I blamed him for my own inability to handle adult obligations. The psychological jargon he was spouting sounded rehearsed and hollow, clearly designed to provide a pseudo-scientific explanation for his criminal behavior that would somehow absolve him of full responsibility for his choices. Even his supposed acknowledgement of wrongdoing was carefully constructed to minimize his culpability and maximize my sympathy. But Mark's true motivation became clear when he shifted to discussing his current desperate situation with barely concealed financial desperation. "I'm living in a halfway house right now, Mom sharing a room with men who have committed violent crimes. I can't afford basic necessities, and I'm facing complete financial ruin because of the restitution payments and legal fees." His voice took on the wheedling quality I remembered from his previous attempts at financial manipulation throughout his adult life. "I know the legal settlement gave you some compensation for what I put you through, and I'm not asking for charity or handouts. Maybe there could be some way I could earn a small income helping around the house, some way I could prove that I've changed while I get back on my feet." The audacity was breathtaking, even for Mark. After stealing Tommy from the only loving home he had ever known, after forcing me to spend years fighting through the legal system to bring him back, after causing untold psychological damage to a vulnerable child, he was actually asking me to employ him and provide him with financial support during his recovery from the consequences of his own criminal behavior. I could help with yard work, household maintenance, maybe even assist with Tommy's care under your supervision. He continued with increasing desperation. I know I don't deserve your trust, but maybe I could earn it back. Slowly prove that prison changed me, and that I understand what really matters now. As I listened to his carefully rehearsed performance, I felt nothing but a profound detachment and complete emotional freedom from any obligation to this man who had never been anything more than a source of pain and manipulation in my life. The Carol, who had once desperately wanted Mark's approval and affection, was gone, entirely replaced by a woman who understood that some relationships are too damaged to salvage, and some people are incapable of genuine change. I allowed Mark to complete his entire pathetic plea without interruption, watching his increasing desperation as he realized that his emotional manipulation was having no impact whatsoever on my resolve. When he finally finished speaking, the silence between us stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mark, I said finally, my voice calm and completely devoid of the emotional vulnerability that had once made me susceptible to his manipulation. You made your choices. You chose selfishness over your son's welfare. You chose convenience over responsibility, and you chose cruelty over compassion when you stole Tommy from his home and tried to destroy my reputation. I paused, looking directly into his eyes to ensure he understood the finality of what I was about to say. My heart has healed from the damage you inflicted, but that healing has taught me that there is no place for you in our lives. Tommy's well-being and security are my priorities now, not your convenience or your financial problems. My voice remained steady and professional, as if I were explaining a disciplinary action to a student rather than ending a relationship forever. You are not welcome here, Mark. You are not welcome in Tommy's life, and you are not welcome to disrupt the peace and stability we have worked so hard to rebuild after your betrayal. I stepped back and began to close the door, my movement calm and deliberate. The consequences you are facing are the direct result of your own criminal choices, and I have no obligation to rescue you from them. If you appear on this property again, I will call the police and have you arrested for violating the restraining order that is still in effect. I closed the door with quiet finality and immediately activated the security system that had become second nature after years of protecting Tommy from those who had tried to harm him. Through the window, I watched Mark stand on the porch for several long minutes, apparently unable to process that his final manipulation attempt had failed so completely. The absolute detachment I felt was liberating beyond description. I had achieved complete control over my own life and Tommy's future, free from any obligation to maintain relationships that serve no purpose other than to threaten our security and happiness. The profound peace that settled over me as Mark finally walked away was unlike anything I had experienced during my decades of trying to maintain family harmony, regardless of the personal cost. I had learned that some people are simply incompatible with a peaceful, authentic life, and that choosing Tommy's well-being over destructive family obligations was not selfish, but necessary. Standing in the home that Tommy and I shared, surrounded by the evidence of his continued growth and the genuine love of people who understood the value of protecting vulnerable children, I felt the ultimate freedom that comes from refusing to be manipulated by people who have forfeited any right to consideration through their own choices. The quiet joy I felt was profound and lasting, knowing that Tommy was safe, that our bond was legally protected, and that my fight had created safeguards for other vulnerable families facing similar threats. The war was finally completely over, and I had achieved something far more valuable than victory. I had achieved the kind of peace that can only come from absolute clarity about one's own worth and the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. 5 years have passed since that final encounter with Mark on my front porch, and my life has become a testament to the transformative power of refusing to accept injustice and fighting for truth with unwavering determination. Tommy and I have not just survived the betrayal and abandonment we faced, we have thrived in ways that would have been impossible without the painful journey that forced us to discover our own strength and resilience. My home has been restored to its true purpose as a sanctuary of love and growth, where Tommy continues to reach new milestones and develop his remarkable potential under the care of someone who understands that love and professional expertise are not mutually exclusive. The rooms once violated by Mark's greed and Shirley's malice now welcome a steady stream of families seeking guidance, fellow advocates sharing resources, and friends who understand that chosen family can be stronger than biological bonds. I have become a nationally recognized voice in the fight for disabled children's rights and protection of elderly caregivers, serving on advisory boards for federal agencies and speaking at conferences across the country about the importance of legal safeguards against family manipulation and abandonment. The intellectual and professional connections I have built through my advocacy work have enriched my life in ways I never experienced during my years of trying to please people who were fundamentally incapable of appreciation or respect. The transformation within me has been profound and lasting, reaching depths of self-understanding and purpose that I never achieved during my decades as someone who defined herself entirely through service to others without boundaries or expectations of reciprocity. I am no longer the woman who believed that unconditional love meant accepting abuse and manipulation from family members who viewed kindness as weakness. I have discovered that my greatest strength lies not in my willingness to sacrifice everything for others, but in my ability to distinguish between genuine need and selfish exploitation, between protecting the vulnerable and enabling the destructive. The profound inner peace I have achieved comes from understanding that love without boundaries is not love at all, but a form of enabling that ultimately harms everyone involved. My morning routine now includes reading with Tommy in the sunroom that overlooks the garden, where he helps me tend to the flowers that bloom more magnificently with each passing season. As we work together on his communication exercises and celebrate his continued progress, I am reminded daily that the most beautiful growth often comes from the most challenging circumstances, and that authentic happiness is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose and unshakable love. The profound lesson that has emerged from this painful but ultimately liberating journey is that the deepest love can indeed be met with the cruelest betrayal, but true purpose is found in unwavering dedication to those who need protection most. Even when family fails through selfishness and manipulation, resilience, integrity, and the power of truth can prevail, leading not just to vindication, but to a renewed purpose and an enduring legacy that extends far beyond blood ties. Standing in my garden this morning, watching Tommy carefully water the roses while describing their colors in the expanding vocabulary that reflects his continued growth, I am filled with a serene smile that reflects the hard-won wisdom of a woman who has faced the worst that human nature can offer and emerged stronger, more purposeful, and more authentically herself than ever before. Some burdens are shed through courage and determination, but the greatest loves are carried forward with pride, and they ultimately lead to triumph that transforms pain into purpose and suffering into strength that protects others from similar harm.